We talked about quasicrystals, which are this unusual type of metamaterial, and they can use this to create optical stealth or radar stealth. And he describes in the presentation there, I think he called it an electrochromatic coating, which that name suggests to me that by applying a particular voltage to this material, you can change the reflectivity or the colour to match, maybe the colour of the sky that you're in, so you can give it some measure of stealth. Now, again, go and look at quasicrystals, look at the web page, and as Ed told me, a man called Dan, I think it was Dan Shechtman, he won the Nobel Prize, I think, for chemistry or physics in 2011. I mentioned this in the videos for his work on quasicrystals. But originally, when he started his research, he was, he was vilified for it. He was lambasted, and so it appears that this is one of those areas of research which perhaps they didn't want people looking into a few years ago, because the military had their own version of it and wanted to keep that secret. Whereas now they've probably got something much better, so they don't mind that the white world quasicrystal research has started to catch up a bit. And this has been a running theme. A lot of the things that Ed has said, and he makes quite a strong point about this. He was saying them in 1998, and at that time they were quite kind of science fiction. But things like quasicrystals, as you say, and some of the plasma physics, they've since kind of advanced in the white world to many of the sort of areas that Ed was talking about in '98.
And we featured another whistleblower who mentioned plasma physics, who claimed that they had craft that had been to Mars in a previous show.
Yeah, that's right.
Because assuming all this is true, and I suspect that it is, because I think Ed Fouche is a 100% genuine guy. He's produced hundreds of documents to verify his credibility. As you said, he took part in a Channel 4 documentary in what year?
It was filmed in '98.
98, but he was only featured for about 3 minutes.
That's right.
Like an hour and a half long.
Well, it was actually, the whole thing was it was called Riddle of the Skies. People may be familiar with it, some of the longer time viewers. And it was 3 hours, 3 hours airtime, but obviously about 3 times 45 minutes, total running time. Yeah.
So any genuine media organisation worth its salt that come across Ed Fouche should be making a 3 hour long documentary about his.
Yeah, well, I did.
Yeah, but they've just played it down.
Yeah.
They've given him a little bit of airtime. They've taken photographs of all his documents and what have you. And even the alternative media, it appeared at the time, didn't seem that interested.
No.
For example, the Art Bell show. Just tell us what happened there.
Well, that's right. I mean, he in '98 came out with these disclosures. Mm-hmm. They tried. Somebody asked him to go on Coast to Coast, and then he was contacted to say, oh, they cancelled it because of a scheduling problem, and then he was rescheduled, and they cancelled it again. And he was never on Coast to Coast. He never ended up being on there, despite this very powerful and very well backed information.
One thing that's always intrigued me about this sort of technology, you're talking 600 feet triangle, right? It's got to be being kept somewhere. Now, it may be that there's a whole fleet of them on the backside of the moon, and that's where they're parked up.
Maybe.
But he's asked that question by Michael Schratt. He says he thinks that they might be kept underwater somewhere or under the ground. Now, he has spoken about underground facilities. Just tell us a bit about what he said about EG&G and their development of underground bases at Area 51 and places like that.
Well, he has become aware of some of these facilities. I mean, we talked about this a lot in our videos, or a fair bit, and I can't remember all the details off the top of my head now. But I do remember that he worked at underground facilities at Edwards Air Force Base, and there was another one where they had a lot of these golf ball dishes. I'm trying to remember where that was, and he discovered that there was an underground facility there which he went to work in, and he describes going into this tunnel where they had to go to service some equipment, and then there were other tunnels going off of it, and there was a security door with a panel where you put a code in to get into this other area. So he knew that it went off into other areas that he wasn't given access to. So it was big. In other words, it was bigger than the part that he was in. So he worked in several underground facilities, mainly, well, in fact, all were associated with Air Force bases.
They've got these vehicles which can get into space quite easily, probably with not vast amounts of fuel, because they've got this special magnetic field disruptor which negates gravity. They can probably take trips quite easily to and from neighbouring planets and the moon and this kind of thing. So can we just postulate as to what might be going on now? Because, as you said, his information is from 94, 95, and that's his latest information. So there's a fleet of these 600 feet wide secret aircraft that can silently come and go from space and probably into parts of the solar system. What's your guess, Andrew?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting because there was one of the things that Ed mentioned to me recently, just after we did the interviews, was there was this History Channel documentary, and that was on quite recently. You know, sort of, I think it was sort of March 2014, and that talked about a project called, I think, Solar Guardian, which was basically, you know, Solar Guardian was the secret program, or one branch of the secret space program, and that talked about various craft that could travel through the solar system and so on. And if you watch that program, which somebody might have stuck on YouTube, you can probably get it, you know, somehow off the internet. This chap that we've mentioned, Michael Schratt, he's in that program, and they actually talk about the TR3B, but Ed's name is not mentioned at all in the History Channel documentary, which I thought was a bit peculiar. But I do think that this has been developed into a fleet. It may be that, you know,
that would tie up with Gary McKinnon's claims.
Yes, exactly. And you know, Ed was saying it was a space platform, so maybe there is other technology, because remember, Ed was only in contact with, you know, 6 or 7 main people. There will be other black programs as well, which he didn't have any you know, information about. So I would certainly say that there is a secret space program. It's advanced from where the TR3B was. I was talking to somebody in the US in 2008, and they said that somebody they knew had been working on space platforms in the 50s.
Now, one question that always comes to my mind when we start disclosing this kind of information, you think, well, it all seems to be the US secret space program, the NSA, the CIA, the US Air Force. What about what must China be doing or thinking? Because they've got to know. You would have thought, with a country like, say, China or Russia, or countries which we think are independent of the US, but are they really? Is this a world conspiracy, or is it just the United States?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's always very tricky because, as you said, essentially most of the information that's like this we get from the US. We get maybe a little bit from Europe and the UK. But yeah, exactly. What is China doing? Maybe we're having a problem because there's a language barrier, so we don't get to hear what's going on in China because there's, you know, a language barrier. The other aspect is that it is said that there is a world organisation which, you know, is a custodian of this information, with the US at the top. And if you essentially pay your dues to the US in some way, in other words, you know, you'll fall into line with what the people who run in the US want, the people in the shadows, not Barack Obama, then you'll be given access to certain information. In other words, they'll give you some access to this sort of technology.
It's incredible that this technology exists, because if we just think of modern air travel, people getting on jets and cramped sitting there on international travel, when they could all probably just walk into something which is 1,000 feet wide and have a bed or whatever, and it just lifts up and it's there. Yeah. It travels at Mach 9, so you can be in Australia in a few hours. And probably have your own room or whatever, yeah, on this huge craft. You know, that's what travel could be, mm-hmm, if they release this technology.
Absolutely.
But you think there's people actively trying to cover up and discredit the information so that it doesn't get out. Just tell us about that.
anti-gravity is one of those technologies, coupled with the free energy technology, which would completely transform the world that we live in. It would change everything. We wouldn't need roads, we wouldn't need the conventional air travel. It would change everything if we had anti-gravity generators, to use in our everyday lives. It'd change construction, it'd change everything. And I've come to the conclusion that the sorts of things we've been talking about are leakages in the secrecy, and they've got to be managed. And one take I have on this is because of this character called Alien Scientist, who is actually a fellow by the name of Jeremy Riss, who's had quite a popular YouTube channel. And it was actually because of this Alien Scientist that was how I came into contact with Ed Fouche, because Alien Scientist had been publishing hit piece videos on Dr. Judy Wood, who many people have heard me talk about with you, and we've all talked about that extensively. And he'd posted some hit pieces on her on his YouTube channel, and then I noticed that the presentation that we've been watching bits of, 1998, I'd never seen that up until a couple of years ago. Even though it was filmed in 98, it wasn't available on the internet, and it popped up on Alien Scientist's YouTube channel, which I thought was a bit peculiar. And I wrote to Ed Fouche through YouTube, and I said, well, I don't think this Alien Scientist character has been totally honest. I think he's up to something. I think he's helping the cover up. And ultimately it was Ed that wrote to me, because he'd become unhappy with what this Alien Scientist was doing with the information that Ed had given Alien Scientist, Jeremy Riss. And so Ed had sort of Ed contacted me, and we mutually decided to do these lengthy interviews. So, and of course the anti-gravity connection to 9/11 is the research of John Hutchison, who's also produced anti-gravity type effects with some of his experiments. And the Alien Scientist character had stuff about John Hutchison on his channel, and he also had stuff about another fellow we haven't mentioned yet called Eugene Podkletnov, who's I think from one of the Eastern Bloc countries, and he developed a force beam, which you and I were talking about yesterday, where if you could have a force beam, in other words like a force of gravity that you could direct down to the ground, for example from something like a TR3B, it would act like a tripod leg, even though there's nothing physically there, and you could eventually prop this craft up on a force beam. And
or you could fire it at the moon and push yourself along.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, you could use it to, or you could have two beams, one firing at the ground and one off the moon or something, and then propel yourself in a given direction. And it was Podkletnov that had discovered this, and that was also this Podkletnov video suddenly surfaced on Alien Scientist channel. I wondered where he got all these from. So it looked like he'd become a host for all this information, keeping it in one place.
And then putting a debunking spin on it.
Well, when he needed to. I mean, he did that with Ed eventually. He eventually put debunking stuff about Ed on his channel.
All right then, Andrew, thanks again for your comments. Fascinating stuff as usual. And it just remains for me to say, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.